So, we're starting off our second week in this series called Prism, Faith Through Other Eyes. Last weekend, I introduced this series, but I wanted to give a recap of what we're doing and why we're doing it as Mission Gathering. First, in case you didn't know, Mission Gathering is a Christian church. What that means is that we belong to a 2,000-year-old tradition formed around the life and the teachings of the renegade rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. At Mission Gathering, the only common commitment that we ask of everyone is that we are committed to following in the teachings of Jesus in our lives and in our world in whatever way that looks for us. But being part of the Christian church and followers of Jesus, and by the way, you can be part of a Christian church and not follow Jesus. How many people know that? Amen. But being a part of a Christian church and following Jesus doesn't mean necessarily that you have to belong to this religion called Christianity. Rather, but being a part of this tradition, we need to own the good and the bad and embrace all that Christianity has brought to the world. If we're going to call ourselves Christians, we need to own all of the good things that come with being Christians and own all of the negative things that have happened over the past 2,000 years in the name of Christianity. Last week, I spoke about the insidious disease of Christian privilege, the reality that in the Western world, Christianity is lauded as the superior and supreme religion, the best worldview, and that almost every aspect of our society is based on a Christian perspective. The problem is that when we relate to our neighbors of other faiths, this puts them in a position of marginalization. In a culture that promotes Christianity, again, Christianity, not the teachings of Jesus, but the religion called Christianity, we are excluding and pushing others to the side. And anyone who follows Jesus should be deeply convicted when we have become a force for oppression and marginalization in the world. See, Jesus didn't call us to Christianize our culture. He didn't even call us to make everyone converts to this religion called Christianity. Instead, he called us to be faithful disciples of his path of self-sacrificial love, regardless of our faith or culture or background. We're called to love without labels and to invite all people to explore Jesus' path that he promised would lead us to a more abundant life in whatever tradition they might belong to. So, as a way of, now my shirt's unraveling up here, as a way of addressing this, I hope it doesn't fall apart, that would be weird. As a way of addressing this as a Christian church here in San Diego, we're setting out over the next 3 weeks to listen and to learn from our neighbors of other faiths. And again, our goal is to humble ourselves, to sit at the feet of our neighbors, to hear their perspectives, and to listen to God speaking through them and their traditions. And as we do that, we'll learn. And learning is a fundamental posture of following Jesus, if you didn't know. We're not here to debate. We're not here to critique. We're here to listen and to learn. Because we can't love our neighbors as ourselves if we don't know our neighbors, can we? And I don't know about you, but in a world today, to be a so-called Christian, there are so many so-called Christian voices that are more inspired to speak up on their own behalf instead of listening to others. Isn't our media filled with so-called Christian voices that talk and talk and talk and force and force and force, but never actually sit to hear the voice of their other? And unless we're willing to do that, we can't really love. Are you with me? Good. Today, we have the privilege of listening and learning about our neighbors from the Buddhist tradition. Now, to be clear, we are going to hear one person's perspective on Buddhism. Granted, this person is very well-versed in many forms of Buddhism, I found out this morning. But I also want to say that Buddhism, like Christianity, has many different denominations and traditions, just like in Christianity. If my shirt falls apart, goodness gracious. But before I invite our guest up here to have a conversation, I'm going to do my best to give a brief primer on the background of the Buddhist tradition. In 480 BCE, in the town of Lumbini, Nepal, 6 centuries before the birth of Jesus, a boy was born into the world whose name was Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha was the son of wealthy parents, and he was in the highest caste or social class of his day. Legend has it that on the night Siddhartha was conceived, Queen Maya, his mother, dreamt of a white elephant with six tusks entering into her right side. And 10 months later, Siddhartha was born. Siddhartha was set to have the life of a prince. He had 3 palaces prepared for his enjoyment. By the age of 16, he married, he had a child, and he spent 29 years of his life as a prince, with all the material pleasures and treasures that come with being a prince. At age 29, Siddhartha leaves his palace, and he meets his subjects for the first time. His father had worked hard to prevent his son from seeing the suffering in the world around him. As Siddhartha goes out, he sees an aging, elderly man for the first time. This astounded the young prince, and he continued to make other trips outside of the palace, where he encountered people from other castes. He encountered a corpse, a diseased man, and an ascetic who had renounced all the material pleasures of the world. Astounded by the suffering in our world and supremely dissatisfied with the life of wealth and pleasure that he was living, Siddhartha leaves his palace and voluntarily takes on the life of a beggar. Even as a beggar, he was recognized and was offered another throne by another royal family, and this was a temptation he went through, but he rejects it. Siddhartha becomes a disciple of 2 teachers of yogic meditation. The first man's name was Alar Kalama. After excelling under Kalama, Siddhartha was asked to succeed him in his tradition, but he was unsatisfied with the particular tradition he was in, and so he moved on. Siddhartha then studied under a man named Uddaka Ramaputta, and Siddhartha succeeded and was offered to be Ramputta's successor, but again, was dissatisfied with just this one tradition, and so he moved on. After living the life of a beggar and realizing that it didn't bring him what he needed to have for enlightenment, but found that the meditative practices were helping him move into higher states of consciousness, Siddhartha began to develop something that has now become known as the middle way, a path of moderation between extreme sacrifice and extreme indulgence. Siddhartha was frustrated by the struggles he faced trying to find meaning and fulfillment in life. And so eventually he sits down under a Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India, and vowed not to move until he had found enlightenment. After 49 days of meditation, Siddhartha attained enlightenment and became known as the Buddha, which is a title that means awakened one, in a similar way as Christ is a title that means anointed one. After attaining enlightenment, Buddha struggled with whether he should try to teach others this path that he had discovered, and eventually was convinced to do so. The Buddha then traveled and taught this path of awakening and gained many new disciples. The story and teachings of the Buddha continue on and are contained in a variety of Buddhist scriptures today. The teaching of Buddha is generally called the Dharma, which I liken to the Christian term gospel, which contains the core message of awakening through self-sacrifice and knowledge. Of course, this is an incredibly abbreviated version of the life of the Buddha, and I'm not one to particularly be the expert on this topic, but thankfully we have one here today to help me out if I messed up any of those details. But like Christianity, Buddhism emerged over hundreds of years with hundreds of versions and traditions. And for the past 2,000 years or so, 2,500 years, entire cultures have been shaped by Buddhist philosophy. And the last thing I want to note before inviting our guest up today to have a conversation about Buddhism is this: that out of most other religious traditions in our world, I think that Buddhism and Christianity contain probably the most similarities in some ways. The way of the Buddha and the way of the Christ are incredibly similar in many ways. Now, this isn't to conflate them. They're two different religions, and they have their own traditions and cultures and beliefs and practices, which must be respected. But there's been a lot of work done to compare the teachings of the Buddha and the Christ. And today I want to encourage you, if you're interested in this conversation, to check out a few of these resources. The first one is a book by a man named Marcus Borg, a Christian scholar, called Jesus and the Buddha. The next book is written by the Dalai Lama, which is called The Good Heart, a Buddhist perspective on the teachings of Jesus. And I always mess up his name, but you can see his name up there. Thich Nhat Hanh, I think. Living Buddha, Living Christ, another great book. And then the last one that I would recommend, if you're really interested in seeing a Christian's perspective on it, is called Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. Interesting resources, and we have them listed in Sacred Ground, so if you would like to study a little bit more, I encourage you to pick these up. So, now that I've given my very best brief overview of Buddhism, I want to bring up a special guest for conversation today. Her name is Karma Lekshe Somo, and she's a renowned specialist in Buddhist studies. Has taught at the University of San Diego since 2000, and there she integrates scholarship and social activism through, and you're going to have to help me with the name, Sake, I'll have you say it, but a beautiful international association of Buddhist women, and the Jamyang Foundation, an innovative education project for women in developing countries. With 15 schools in the Indian Himalayas, Bangladesh, and Laos. Professor Somo's doctoral research focused on death and identity in China and Tibet, and she's the author of Sisters in Solitude, 2 traditions of monastic ethics for women, and Into the Jaws of Yama, Lord of Death, Buddhism, Bioethics, and Death, and numerous other articles. So we are so honored to have the venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Somo with us today. So I'd like to invite you to come forward. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And to start off, I just want to ask the basic question that I think would be good to introduce you to everybody, and that is, and I think it should be on, who are you? What's your path? How did you become a Buddhist nun and a scholar in the Buddhist faith?
Okay. Well, aloha, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you on this beautiful sunny morning. In 25 words or less. Well, I grew up in Malibu with a Southern Baptist mom and a capitalist father, and in the middle of a hedonist society with lots of lessons to be learned. But the interesting thing is that my family name was Zen. It's spelled Z-E-N-N, a good German name, but it sounds like Zen Buddhism. And in that sort of bohemian atmosphere of the 50s in Malibu, I was led directly to books on Buddhism. So I had to figure out why the kids at school were teasing me about it, about being a Buddhist. So I had to find out what it was. And when I read these books, it made perfect sense to me. So I never rejected my Christian tradition. The teachings of Jesus totally spoke to me, and I still try to live them in every way I can. But there were certain philosophical details that I didn't quite understand. So that's an introduction.
Totally, yeah. And I think I tried to touch on it a little bit, but you're much better equipped to talk about it. What would you say the core principles or the gospel, so to speak, in a Buddhist tradition would be? Like, what is the core teaching that Buddhists around the world share?
Well, you did a really wonderful job of summing up the life of the Buddha and his search for meaning, you could say. And the main question that he had in mind was human suffering and what to do about it. So he set out to try to find an answer to this question. And not just suffering in terms of raw pain, physical and emotional, but also this sort of gnawing sense of dissatisfaction that people feel. That causes all kinds of causes us to act out in some pretty weird ways sometimes. And just this endless dissatisfaction. We see it everywhere here. We live in such an affluent society, and yet, right, it's never enough. Whatever we have is never enough. So his path was really about love and compassion, developing wisdom to understand the human condition, how we cause ourselves endless problems by our ego fixation, our self-cherishing attitude, and greed, hatred, and ignorance, the basic problems, and how to overcome them.
Yeah. And so, and what does the path, so would every Buddhist, they're on a path towards enlightenment, right? Or how does that work? Because the Buddha attains enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Does every Buddhist get to that stage as well, or how does that work out?
Well, every human being, every sentient being, that means any being with consciousness, and the Buddhists include the animals too, right, has the potential to become liberated from an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. And the Buddhists, because the tradition grew up in South Asia, they also believe in rebirth. So the idea is that through cultivating our minds, learning to control our minds, we can control the quality of our actions. And by learning to control the quality of our actions, we can evolve spiritually. We can avoid doing unwholesome actions that lead to unhappy results. So that's the basic idea.
Yeah. And just one more, I might be pressing too much into it, but so Buddhist life practice, what does it look like for a Buddhist to wake up in the morning, and what does it look like to apply the teachings of the Buddha throughout the day?
Okay, so of course there are different paths for different people, and as you so skillfully mentioned, the Buddhist traditions over the last 2,500 years have been evolving in all different kinds of cultures. From early India into China, and Sri Lanka, Thailand, Russia, Japan, and now the United States. So in every culture, it takes on a different flavor. So there's no prescription. Normally, the Buddhists would try to avoid unwholesome actions and do wholesome actions. And then a lot of them do meditation practice in order, just like a rehearsal for real life,
Sure.
where we get in touch, try to calm down, recognize the defilements of the mind, the conflicting emotions that cause us a lot of grief, and gradually to try to eliminate some of our constant greediness, neediness, and aversions, right? Start to recognize how the mind works. So it could take the form of formal meditation practice, but it's something that's meant to be applied to every action of everyday life. So we check up our inner life, notice when attachment and aversion arise. First is to notice it, right? Because that's to recognize this cycle, this syndrome that we're in that causes us to be constantly dissatisfied. And because of that sense of lack, we try to fill it up with all kinds of things. Food, sex, substances of all kinds, television, all of our addictions, right? Instead of looking directly at the mind itself. So the Buddhists really advise us to get in touch with the way our mind works and how it can create happiness for us, or it can create a lot of problems for us, right?
Yeah, and I think what sounds really similar to hearing that, we teach Jesus has this idea of the kingdom of God being within and the kingdom of God being without. And it's finding that inner connection with God and the true self within before you can actually live out the kingdom of God in the world. And on that, you're also very engaged in social activism and creating a better world. And it's Earth Day, and I totally forgot about that, but it's been reminded multiple times this morning. What does it look like as a Buddhist to engage in actually transforming the world? Because I know that's a big part of the tradition for many people, especially in regards to the world itself, the natural world.
Okay, well, in this Okay, so I think that Buddhism and Christianity have much in common and much to offer the world. I mean, we're in a mess, right? We're in a mess as a nation. We're in a mess globally. And what are we going to do about it? So Christianity and Buddhism also have amazing resources to try to address these crises that we face. And so I think that it is a challenge, but it's a good challenge to try to bring the spiritual dimension of our life into practical solutions for the world's problems. So one thing that the Buddhists have to offer, in addition to love and compassion for all sentient beings, which is important, I'll come back to it, but also the idea that we're all interconnected. You know, we think we're so important, right? We act as if we're the most important person in the world. I mean, from morning to night, right? If we're honest. And yet, there's more than 7 billion other people out there who are also wrapped up in this delusion or this self-obsession, right? So how are we going to get over it? And that's just talking about human beings. The animals far outnumber us, right? So when we, use our plastic everything and, get involved in convenience for me, trumping the health of the planet, then we're actually endangering both ourselves and others. And that is a natural corollary of this idea that we're all interrelated. No one is an island. Everything we do, every breath I take is less oxygen for you. Every time I breathe out, that's more carbon dioxide I'm creating. I mean, we're intimately interconnected. And that kind of a recognition can help us become more aware of our buying choices and our lifestyle choices and everything that we do. So I think that compassion entails social action. I don't see how we can talk love and compassion and just sit and, be self-centered. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense, right? So we have to try to move out and find ways that we can help improve and contribute to avert what seems to be a disaster, imminent disaster. And that can take many forms. Sure. Right? If everybody just pulls up one little piece of the sky, I mean, the projects that I'm doing is something that, I don't know what I was thinking. It sounded like a good idea at the time, to start all these schools. But you can imagine that it's not that easy working with different cultures and languages and, tax laws. And oh my gosh, it's very complicated. But we all figure out something that we can do to contribute to the planet, and then just do the best we can, right? This kind of social action also informs our spiritual life because it constantly challenges us to see, our own limitations and to break through them, right? I don't really buy into the American thing like it's all about me. No, it's not. Actually. And limitations, what limitations? Jesus didn't talk about limitations. The Buddha didn't talk about limitations. They talked about, giving with our whole heart. We use only a tiny fraction of our intellectual resources, and we can do so much more. Everybody has 24 hours in the day, last time I checked. So we can make the most of them, eh?
Yeah, I love it. And I messed up the name. Can you tell me then your international association?
Oh, yes. Okay. Sankirita is the International Association of Buddhist Women. We've got a little gender problem in the Buddhist traditions worldwide.
We do too. So.
Actually, I noticed that. Another similarity. So, let's work together, see if we can solve this problem. But as it turns out, the Buddha himself, like Jesus himself, was quite woman-friendly. In fact, they broke all kinds of barriers of inclusion in terms of the disadvantaged and including women, right? But over the years, somehow patriarchy tend to reassert itself. And that's the situation we find ourselves in now. So about 30 years ago, Buddhist women started to wake up and realize that we had an issue, right? We're in California. We don't have problems. We just have issues. Okay.
I love it. Yep.
Okay, so we got together and decided we should talk about it. And it just happened that the Dalai Lama was in town, so he came around. So there were 1,500 people gathered, and he was very encouraging. And we all recognized that the first step was education, because women globally, now we, the privileged, I assume most of us are privileged in our own ways. And one thing that the US has had is 12 years of free education. Um, so that is a great privilege. But not everybody in the world has that opportunity, and women have often been left out. Even though countries like Laos and India may have educational opportunities for everyone, but a lot of people can't afford the books or the uniform, right? So if they can only send one child to school, it'll usually be the boy, and so the girls get left out. So Sakadita works internationally to encourage women in all regards, and this with a special sort of emphasis on education, and also opportunities for ordination for women, which is to give women role models or examples of what they can become. I mean, for a woman to be speaking on a microphone, it's completely unheard of in many cultures, you know? And so we're trying to break through some of those stereotypes about what women can and cannot do. And it's going very well. We've made tremendous strides in the last 30 years. So working internationally and then locally, I've been doing the education projects through Jamyang Foundation. And I forgot to bring brochures because, well, if the Buddhists got organized, we'd be dangerous.
I love it. That's fantastic. If we got organized at Mission Gathering around here, we'd be... Anyways, most disorganized church, mostly because of me. But, so, you've kind of already touched on it, but I think it's an interesting question. And I imagine it's probably similar, but what are the biggest challenges of being a Buddhist in America in 2018?
Okay, well, I think that the stark materialism is one thing to think about. It's just taken for granted that material things matter more than anything, that everyone deserves a luxurious life. But wait a second, when a third of the people on the planet don't have enough to eat today, how did we come into this delusion? I think that there's a lot of self-absorption. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that we need to think outside our bubbles. That's very important. Second, as a Buddhist, the information that we're getting, people are barraged by propaganda from the television, from the channels of government, from every direction. And I think that a lot of people have forgotten how to think for themselves. So in the case of, this is really important. As a democratic society, we have to challenge the script we're being given. And a lot of the ideas that are coming across through the mainstream media, it's, well, in addition to being a lot of it blatant lies, it also sends a very questionable message about human meaning and purpose. So I think that's, because Buddhism is a tradition that calls us to question everything. I mean, question everything from the start, right? Challenge it. And so challenge all our assumptions about what we're doing here and what society expects from us. I mean, I'm a 60s person in addition, which I'm Berkeley radical. So, I mean, I think somebody's got to do it, right? Someone's got to say that the emperor has no clothes. So it's vitally important for us on a personal level and also on a national and global level. So that's challenging. Also, time. There are all of these distractions to fill up our time. And it's almost cliche now to talk about all of our devices and how we're addicted to these devices, which consume our time. And I think we have to think carefully about that. Of course, they're very useful. They can even be useful for helping people, and yet it's become a bit overwhelming. When it takes you 3 hours to work through your email every day, I mean, is this normal? Is this okay? Is this worthwhile? Not necessarily. Sign those petitions, yeah, but wait a second. When are we going to find time for prayer or meditation or, making sandwiches and, working for the homeless and all of our other important projects? So these are some of the, don't get me started.
Oh, I love it. This is preaching up here. I love it. It's so good. Yeah, I think the next question is, again, I want to be careful. There's in the conversation of comparative religion, it's important to not try to conflate religion, right? So I want to be careful about that. But I do think there's a lot of similarities in Christianity and Buddhism. And there's a lot of, as you already said, common causes and things that we can come together on. So the question is, how can Christians relate to Buddhists, and how can Buddhists relate to Christians better in our pluralistic American society?
Good. I think this is really great. We're teaching a class this semester on Buddhism and Christianity in dialogue. So I love that you showed some of the books. It's been so fascinating. And my dialogue partner is a Catholic, right? So, and we have 50 victims. So it's really great and challenging assumptions in all directions. Yeah. Of course, we can emphasize the commonalities, such as love and compassion. I mean, there can't be enough in the world. Who said, whatever the question, love is the answer, right? And so emphasizing this, I think, is to the benefit of all. The other thing is the idea of, the Buddhists would say contentment, where Jesus said, give up all that ye have and follow me. It's a call to not get wrapped up in all the bling and all the stuff that we think we need, right? But to be content, be happy. I mean, why not? Be happy, right? We have a choice. We can be constantly on the rat race, but remember, as long as you're in the rat race, you're still a rat. Even if you win, you're still a rat, right? So, to be content, what can be happier than that? And both Jesus and the Buddha were very clear about being peace. Being peace, which means, stop, take a minute, be peace, because then whatever else we do, we go to the marches, we go to the office, we go to school, whatever we do, we're going to do it better because we'll be operating from a place of peace and love, right? There's so many other possibilities. I think, all the Beatitudes, it's like, it's perfect, it's Buddhism in a sense. Also, I think to emphasize the spiritual dimension of life. People are so crazed with looking outward. It's time to remember and remind each other to look inside. Slow down, look inside. I think that's also very important. So there are differences also philosophically in the question of God. Okay, so Buddhists don't really talk about God so much. I mean, there are gods around. They're not atheists. Like in South Asian societies, plenty of gods. They're probably right here because I love this kind of stuff, this conversation, right? And but that's not the big question. The question is suffering and what to do about it, right? And whether there is a God or there isn't a God, it doesn't really change the human situation. What we need to do is to learn how to live with love and wisdom, right? So this brings us to the point of karma, which simply means action, yeah? And this is in the Hebrew Bible, too. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Sorry, I got the King James, but...
I love it.
My generation. And my grandmother didn't speak English. She quoted scripture. There was a Bible verse for every occasion.
It's a good Southern Baptist with the King James Version.
Exactly. There we go. And so this just means that we need to be aware of our actions. Every thought, every word, every physical action has a consequence. If we understood this basic principle, we might live in a different way. One thing that the Buddhists emphasize a great deal is the question of death and impermanence, that life is short. And therefore, I mean, pardon me, but I think a lot of us are like halfway to the grave already.
Preach.
So, I mean, wake up call, you know? What are we going to do with it? Now, I mean, don't we want to do something useful with our lives? We don't know how much time we have left. And as many of us know, as we get older, our capabilities often decline, our energy level, and sometimes our mobility are impaired. And therefore, while we're still Genki, while we're still like, still vertical, then we should try to make the most of this human opportunity. To be a human is an incredibly special blessing. Because as a human being, with all of our differences, we have the potential to do great good in the world. We can also do great harm, but let's not do that. Let's do great good in the world, right? Together.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah. I feel like my final question to land the plane is arbitrary because I feel like you just answered it. But what would be the one message that you would want to leave with a group of progressively minded Christians here today from a Buddhist perspective on what we can do better and how we can engage in the world better?
Well, I think what we can all do is to see love in every person. And this actually goes along very well with what you were talking about, listening. There's so many people talking, but how many people are listening with love? This will be so valuable, especially in our relationships, right? Often when we have a conversation, we're not really listening. We're planning our next move, right? And as a result, we often make mistakes. We misunderstand the person we're talking to, and that can cause so many problems. Everybody wants to be heard. The best gift we can give them really is to listen mindfully, compassionately, attentively. It's a great exercise for many reasons. The Buddhists do it as a kind of mindfulness exercise, part of the learning to rein in the wild monkey of the mind, right? To focus, right? So we use our conversation partner as the focus of our mindfulness practice. What that does is to get ourself out of the way, even for one moment. And we find that it's such a beautiful feeling to be free of that constant ego clinging, right? Just let go, just for a moment, and be completely with the other person. So we do this with love and compassion, and we might even learn something by listening. So if we move through our day with this idea of listening with love, and just not only listening to people, but to like the birds and everything going on around us, it's a magical experience, and we wake up to the human opportunity. Really, we really make the most of our lives. So that would be my humble offering to you.
Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I feel like I could be in conversation with you all day. There's so much wisdom and so much beauty there. So thank you so much for sharing with us. And yeah, let's give the Venerable Karma Lekshe Tsoma one more round of applause.